Good evening. This is a great crowd. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Thank you to the students for joining us today. We're doing something different. It looks physically different to you. We don't have one speaker. I should say, by the way, at the outset, I'm filling in for Jim Van Epps, our president, tonight, who's happily on overseas travel. This is a unique kind of program. I'll get into it momentarily, but we really, I think all of us depend on have throughout our lives depended on foreign correspondents for trying to figure out. It's hard enough you have more sources to find out how things are going in the United States and far fewer sources to learn more about what is happening in places that you don't know very much about, whose systems you don't know very much about. So we all have relied on foreign correspondents over the years. They are a diminishing breed, unfortunately, I think I can say, in that fewer media outlets actually, these great people here today, and we have some great former foreign correspondents still working in the business, who have reported from some of the toughest and most interesting places during the most interesting times, and all over the world. There have become, and they were for major news outlets, but it's very expensive to put them in the field, and unfortunately, especially with the changes in media, there are far fewer of it, and I think we're all losers from that, but we are still relying very much on the ones that do exist. First, let me say a couple of things about, to just start in Jim's absence, to tell you about future events and tonight's sponsors. First, let me mention our long-time sponsor, Wright, the Wright Auto Group, that you know very, very well, distributors for Buick, GMC, Mercedes, BMW, Sprinter vans, et cetera. We really appreciate the relationship that we've had with Wright over the years. And our platinum sponsor, the Planters Inn, which has graciously housed our guests who are coming in from outside down in Reynolds Square. A great place to stay. And our third sponsor for tonight, Morrison Templeton Insurance, who give great and very personal insurance service and guidance to their customers. So we thank all of them for sponsoring us and recognizing the value of what the Council on World Affairs does here in Savannah. Just a quick note about what will be. We're about to change things, as you know. We've been advertising this a bit over the last few months. We're going to be moving to the Coastal Georgia Center down on Farm Street near the Visitor Center. I don't know if you have a financial stake in the center or what that is, but okay, there you go. But I hope really we will see all people downtown. I'll get to that in a second. But next month, and we're doing it to add to the change, next month only, we'll be moving off of the Thursday format because of our speaker who is available on a Monday and only on that Monday. But it really should be a great presentation about a subject that we have not covered. Madeline Creed, who's a former principal deputy at the Department of Deputy Administrator at the Department of Energy on nuclear. That's not doing it. I can move further. I don't know if there's a good spot here, but maybe I'll lower it a little bit. And she'll be speaking on. She was part of a bipartisan panel, but Madeline was part of this commission that was commissioned by Congress on both sides, Democrat and Republican, to look at our national nuclear security posture and the challenges that we face from Russia and China, and to take a long look, and you'll be hearing about the results of that bipartisan commission. It's not a subject that, at least as long as I've been here, we've talked about, and I think it's a very interesting one. And then early in December, because of the holidays, we're going to do the December one will be on December 5th, and that will feature former Undersecretary of State and Ambassador David Hale, who's been ambassador to Pakistan, Jordan, Lebanon, and was also Undersecretary of State dealing with the whole range of global issues, and he'll be coming in, and those will both be at the Coastal Georgia Center. Let me just say one thing about about the Coastal Georgia Center, because I really hope that we would see all of you and many more bring new audience, but also keep our existing audience, which is it's very close, should be known to all of you, right next to the visitor center. It's very secure. It has great parking, and we're looking at ride-share options and carpooling if that's of interest. But it's a convenient location and easy to get to, and we'll be giving you more details about it as we move on. Okay, so let me talk again about the speakers that we have, and I'm going to go your right to your left. I'm going to get notes because, these people are former foreign correspondents, still writing on foreign affairs issues. The first on my right is Meg Coker, who I'm going to talk about their backgrounds more, with Cox newspapers, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, geographically Russia, Middle East, Turkey, you name it. 30, how many countries?
32, 33.
Okay. She was the Baghdad Bureau Chief for the New York Times and wrote a book on the Spy Master of Baghdad. I don't know if any of you have read it. It's about the Iraqis' fight against ISIS. You reported on Gaddafi's Libya, I think, yeah. And Turkey Bureau Chief, as she said, for the Journal, right? For the Wall Street Journal, and now is an investigative journalist and editor of an online publication that you're all, I think, pretty familiar with, The Current, here in Savannah, along with her husband Craig Nelson, who is again Associated Press. You guys never just work for one company or one news outlet. You kind of, everybody goes around. Associated Press, Cox newspapers, Sydney Morning Herald, Wall Street Journal, former bureau chief in Kabul, Afghanistan, for the Wall Street Journal. A foreign editor of a publication you may not know about, which is out of the United Arab Emirates, called The National. But if you're interested in Middle East news, it's a good publication. Has quite a few Americans actually who write columns for it from time to time. And then to the left is Robin Wright, whom you may know because you may have seen her on ABC, CBS, NBC as a commentator on the Middle East generally and Iran particularly. But again, you may have seen her on Meet the Press, Face the Nation, This Week, etc. She's written books on the Arab Spring and on Islamism, a book called Rock the Kasbah, some of you might have read. She is at the Wilson Center because she's a think tanker as well as a regular columnist and writer for the New Yorker magazine. She, by the way, Robin and I have known each other for a long time, but Robin was just up at the UN General Assembly briefly and interviewed the president, the relatively new president of Iran, just a couple of weeks ago, and interviewed him twice. And she can even tell you about when she interviewed the now late leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, years ago, right? And you can follow all of them, and you should follow all of them to keep informed. I will ask some questions as a moderator here during what will be a panel discussion, and then, of course, as usual, we will open up to you, and you all, I know, have lots of questions all the time, and we will let them kind of delve into they can draw from their backgrounds rather than going into a lot of detailed questions. I'll ask more general questions, and they can fill in from their experience. So what I thought we'd kick things off first. As I said, we've all benefited, and we really rely on these people to get us the stories from overseas. And my wife Vicki and I, who is also a Foreign Service officer, and she actually dealt with press affairs a lot of the time. We had great relationships with the foreign correspondents with whom we served, and I always admired them. I'm not just saying that because I'm doing this right now. I always had great admiration for the work that they do in very tough environments to get people to tell you things that they don't want to tell you, under circumstances where even regimes are trying to prevent you from getting out the story. So let me just ask, I'll put it out to all of you briefly. How did you, when you first landed in the various places you were at, how did you make contacts and develop contacts and kind of map out your strategies for getting stories? Because, you know, the news business is, we need this fast news on this fast-breaking development, and we need it yesterday. And you have to have already developed the contacts, figured out who's important in the country that you're in. So we'll start with you, Meg, and just go across and then come back the next time. Meg?
Well, I feel like those of us in the hostess city, we should have the guest in Savannah go first,
There we go.
rather than the hometown.
So Robin, by the way, is going to be a good ambassador for Savannah because this is her first time here, but she's really enjoyed it. So, Robin, over to you.
So first of all, let me welcome the students, because everyone in this room was once a student. And we admire you for coming and listening to us tonight. I also want to thank someone who served the United States, whom I interviewed 34 years ago, and he remembers and he still speaks to me. So thank you so much. And he has two sons who have also served.
Did she get you to say something you didn't want to say?
No.
I think for all of us, the most important source we have are not necessarily the high-level presidents, prime ministers, the generals, no offense, but the people on the street where you actually end up finding out what people really think. And that, to me, is the most important. And I think one of the most important things for all of us as correspondents is to know that everyone wants to tell a story about why they are, what they're doing. And so, as Larry mentioned, I have interviewed, the last 6 Iranian presidents and had a working breakfast with the supreme leader of Iran. I've interviewed, most of the bad boys. I also did Gaddafi, several times in his strange tent, not his sleeping tent. I can speak quite loudly without a mic. So I lost several friends who were in the U.S. Marine compound in 1983, and friends at the 2 U.S. embassies in Beirut that were bombed. And I spent a lot of time going to Iran trying to understand why the Iranians were doing this and who was responsible. And it took me 2.5 years, but I finally got to talk to the guy who masterminded a lot of this as the ambassador to Syria. And I remember going in, they finally kind of relented because I pestered so often. And they said, you can see him, but you can't ask him any questions. So I got in to see him, and I said, I'm so sorry that you don't have any time to answer my questions, because I had just one question to ask you. And he said, what was that question? And I said, well, I wanted you to reflect on what were the successes and failures of the Iranian Revolution. 2.5 hours later, I had to excuse myself because I had an appointment in Parliament. So I think what we tend to forget is that, and good correspondents, as these two are, we go out and we are street reporters, but we listen. And we listen to what people tell, how they tell their stories, and why they tell their stories, and why they did the things they do. And that doesn't mean you have to approve, like them, or anything else, but it's hearing their stories and understanding. And that's the most important thing we can do for you as readers, is kind of be the medium, as we say we are, in explaining one side to the other, because you guys, probably out of luck, don't have to talk to the last 6 Iranian presidents or the head of Hezbollah.
Okay, Meg, you wanna go?
Sure. So I I'm a Cold War kid, right? All of the men in my family served in the military. My mother served in the military. We grew up in a very proud Cold War warrior household. I decided when I wanted to become a journalist, what is your marketable skill as you go out in university? I decided I was going to study Russian, and when I graduated, that was my marketable skill. The Soviet Union was breaking apart, and I spoke a language that was rare, actually, in those days. So I think the short answer is I agree with Robin. Having the ability to listen is very important, but also having the ability to speak to someone in their own language is also incredibly helpful. And whatever medium you're connecting with people with, it might surprise the students here, but there was a time when there was no social media. There was a time when you literally had to go knocking on people's doors or find a telephone book? Like what? Those things hardly exist when I was coming up as a journalist too. But I think that from the point of view of finding people to talk to, you have to not be afraid to open your mouth. You have to be curious. You have to, I'm not a natural extrovert. When I wake up in the morning, I actually think of myself as an actor playing a role of an extrovert. And so it makes it much easier for me to go talk to strangers. But I also think about things in terms of my own family, right? I mean, if a stranger has come to town, there might be a lot of wariness about talking to someone who doesn't come from these parts. I always, having grown up with a lot of Southern aunties and my grandmother, hospitality is important, and having this sort of sense of respect is also very important. And when I was still quite young, I went to Afghanistan after 9/11. Young. I mean, I was an early career reporter, as we call them now. So I was a young reporter, and I was trying my best to get stories, right? And you are around people who are twice your age, whatever gender they are. People with more experience, with a little bit more chutzpah, a little bit more, big city swagger. I was in a very strange moment of having taken from after the Taliban fell, after the first president stood up in Afghanistan and things were still really rocky. I took the first flight from Kabul to the east, it was the city in Afghanistan closest to Iran. There was a whole other culture that was going on there, a whole other political reality. And everybody was trying to get an interview with the warlord. And like so much of our world, sometimes it is about where you end up, like being at the right place at the right time. Sometimes it is being lucky enough to get a ticket on that one flight, so you could say, I was the first person in a place at such and such time. But there we all were, like 5-6 of us, all waiting to hear from the warlord, all like petitioning basically for a chance at an interview with this guy who had never talked to a foreign journalist in the 20 years of the Afghan Civil War. And here I was also surrounded by people much older than I and much more experienced than I, and listening to them talk. Don't you know who I am? I'm from the Chicago Tribune. I'm from the New York Times, blah, 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 blah. And these people who live in a totally different reality are like, what? Like, I've never read your newspaper. I don't know who you are. And no, your name means nothing to me. And so I turned on my Southern charm. And I said to the man who was the gatekeeper for the warlord, sir, you don't know me. And even if you knew my publication, you wouldn't think much of it. But if I don't get an interview with your boss, I'm going to lose my job. I was like, please, this job is my first job, and I don't want to lose my job.
How many times did you use that line?
A lot of times.
I've used it, yeah, all the time.
And you know what? It always worked.
Yeah.
Because you speak to something very
Absolutely.
human and very basic in people. Like, I'm a damsel in distress. I'll play that card. I'm not usually a damsel in distress, but actually, when you're all sort of lined up without any cards to play at a high-stakes poker table, you will bluff your way through a door. I wasn't lying. Like, it was on me to get a job in the interview to keep my job, and I got it. And everybody else was like, where did she come from? So, there are tricks of the trade that have to do with with earning people's respect, and sometimes earning people's respect is just treating them as fellow human beings.
So what's your damsel in distress story, Trevor?
I don't have one like that. I'll focus a little bit on U.S. embassies in war zones. In Baghdad and in Kabul, the U.S. embassies, well, in the course of my career, I'm sure you agree with me, U.S. embassies have tightened up. I mean, they are really hard to get information from. And so the best way to get contacts and find out what was going on with U.S. policy was often to go to NGOs. Other foreign embassies were goldmine because there was always a foreign diplomat who wants to talk about what the Americans are doing.
Absolutely true.
And they NGOs have to do meetings. They have to coordinate aid. They have to, for all sorts of reasons, NGOs have to get access to U.S. embassies to find out, in this case, Baghdad and Kabul, to find out what they're doing. So they were huge. They were huge sources of information for me, which isn't to say that the U.S. ambassadors to Kabul or Baghdad when I was there were unpleasant people, but they were, they got to where they were and they were conducting a war, and they didn't want to give you a lot of information about it.
And what about, I'll maybe go in reverse order, what about strategies for getting around actual suppression of the media or attempts to suppress the media, or as we see, for example, in Putin's Russia, imprisoning of foreign correspondents on no basis? How do you you're walking into that kind of environment where you are. How does that change how you go about getting the story?
It's your turn. You're going reverse order.
We're going reverse order. So Meg, you want?
Go ahead. You go, please.
Whatever.
Yeah.
So technology can be your friend in that situation. And again, the world changes very quickly, but back in the Arab Spring, right? So the Christmas time and then early January 2011, when the Arab Spring kicked off in Tunisia, and then the tidal wave of democratic demonstrations went throughout most of the Arab world. So, there were back in those good old days, there were technological tools that regimes didn't know about. You could actually be a lot smarter than what the regimes were capable of, especially if they were falling. So, there were lots of secure online tools in order to talk to people that you couldn't actually meet people face to face. When whole countries are divided by literal front lines, but maybe cultural front lines, online communication was incredibly important. I think it changes because the physical risks that some of our colleagues take these days are, it is quite severe. But at the top end, if a regime really doesn't want you to be there, all they have to do is not issue you a visa, right? So the first step is actually the schmooze game of getting your visas. But once you're there, remaining, again, the very prime directive, I don't know how many of you are Star Trek fans, but the prime directive should always be you do not endanger your sources. And so whatever you need to do to get a story, you have to also have the ethical duty of making sure that whoever you're talking to is not going to face repercussions, and you're going to do whatever that takes in order to keep them safe.
I will just say one parenthetical: when you're on the other side, when you're the interviewee, you develop track records with reporters, correspondents, and if you are not quoted accurately, or if you give up that source, you find out that they actually told somebody it was you who said that, then that's the end. For many of us, that was the end of doing interviews with that person. So in order to protect those relationships, as you say, you have to be straight, and I think the great majority of journalists in general are straight. All the foreign correspondents I knew have been straight, but there are some journalistic environments that just don't respect that very much. Greg?
I was in Havana on an assignment, and I was speaking to human rights activists in Cuba, and one activist really turned the tables because he told me a lot of information about who was imprisoned and who of his colleagues hadn't seen the light of day for a very long time.
Can you talk?
And he said, I said, okay, so what can I use? I mean, what can I report here? And he said to me, he looked at me and said, you decide. I said, no. You can't do that. You cannot do that to me. And he insisted. He absolutely insisted, because I think he wanted reporters who were coming into his country and talking to them to take some responsibility about what they were doing. And that was fair. I didn't report what he said because I thought that it was suicidal. I thought it would have been really unethical for me to do that. But it was a great experience in having a source and turn the tables on somebody who just there temporarily, can leave, has a U.S. passport, and so, yeah.
Robin?
So I want to play off Craig's line, because it's a two-way street. So Larry and I go back 30 years plus, and we have a mutual friend named Ryan Crocker, who he was our ambassador to Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. But when I first met him, he was a young political officer in Beirut, and he kept telling me things. So I once said to him, why are you telling me these things? And he said he didn't want them to go into the circular filing cabinet. So I thought, how interesting, the State Department has circular filing cabinets. So,
They're called Foreign Service officers.
No, don't spoil my punchline. So I went in to see Arnie Rafel, who was our ambassador to Pakistan and died there. He was in a helicopter crash, was ill. But anyway, he was then, I think, assistant secretary. And so I went into his office and I said to him, where are these circular filing cabinets? And he laughed and he said, the wastebasket. So finally I understood that Ryan Crocker was telling me all these things, and he knows that I have now told the story in other audiences, including to other diplomats, because he didn't want his cables that he was writing to Washington with his assessments to go into the wastebasket. And if they were reported in the press, then he might get a cable from Washington that said, well, what about this? We've seen this report. So it is very much a two-way street. And I frankly think that given the way that American embassies have become fortresses because they have been targeted so often, that, no offense, Larry, but that diplomats more often these days want to talk to us because we're out in the streets. We can talk to anybody. We can go to Libya and talk to Gaddafi or, the worst kind of criminals in the world, because that's our job. And so we're often the best intelligence sources the diplomats have.
So can I answer?
Go ahead.
I mean, what I spoke to, and this was when I most recently in Kabul for a couple of years, U.S. diplomats had not left the embassy for 2 years. There wasn't, not a single diplomat had left that embassy. And it was one of the largest, if not the largest embassy in the world. And so they had no eyes, no ears. They were dependent on correspondence. Did they have, I don't know how much the CIA had informants. I'm sure they did, but I was told that they also weren't very well. Yeah, there was that. And they actually didn't have many assets in Afghanistan in the time leading up to the U.S. departure. So that's very dismaying, and that's in the long term for U.S. interests. It's a very bad development.
But it's also another point of why foreign correspondents are so important, and why mainstream media, traditional media, new media should be paying more attention and putting resources into that.
And just to follow on to that, and could you all cite cases where people came to you and told you something and and go tell your friends at the U.S. Embassy this? Or not? No. Okay.
No. I think that there's a lot of street savvy that we're not you guys. that there was a very strong. And when they say U.S. Embassy, sometimes it's a euphemism, right? Because some people might think of you guys as the CIA. I think the conspiracy theorists, and they exist everywhere, definitely don't see lines of delineation. But truly, I think that people who were either, in positions of influence or wanted to be influential, there's definitely those who wanted to get a message out. There's definitely people who want to be amplified. There's definitely crocs and charlatans, and I think those of us who stay in the business long enough know how to assess that sort of source information, just like, hopefully, experienced case officers at the CIA and other agencies will know how to assess that sort of information.
Let me ask all of you, and this is not so you can, toot your horn, but were there cases where you really think that a particular story that you did influenced policy, actually, or international events? Anybody?
Yeah, I can't say that it's a direct 24-hour event. But for sure, I mean that's one of the privileges of working for one of the national media outlets. You know that people who work in the White House read your stories, read your news outlets. I covered major financial crimes and corruption and sometimes. Middle East politics, that's actually what it all is, like dressed up with religious wars, but it's actually about financial corruption. And, there are cases where the U.S. Treasury would start investigating, certain organizations, certain banks on the strength of the reporting that I did for the Wall Street Journal. Impact can be measured in a whole lot of ways. And one of the things that I always have to keep telling people who have been my sources in the Middle East is that there's not a monolithic Washington, right? Like there, as much as there are power cleavages and divides in other capitals around the world, Washington rarely moves at the speed of a snail, and the different power centers are always interacting there. But two of the stories that I'm very proud of in terms of cause and effect is that actually in the Arab Spring, during the Libyan uprisings, I had great sources in the Libyan opposition, and working through a lot of different well-meaning U.S. partners, individual people actually ended up building out the Libyan opposition from soup to nuts. There were groups of telecom executives who happened to be Libyan, who stood up at the entire telecom network for the free side of Libya, for eastern Libya. And we wrote about that, me and a colleague at the Wall Street Journal, and then suddenly it became the way in which the rest of the diplomatic world could actually communicate with Libyan opposition leaders. And I think you can see these things happen sometimes in real time. Sometimes it takes a little longer, but that kept the revolution alive for months.
Others, you want to comment? Greg?
I think one part of being a foreign correspondent is just bearing witness, right? I mean, does it change policy? Probably not. But then I think I covered the Rwandan genocide, and one of the really important things we just had no idea about numbers. So going into these small villages and counting, that was a service. That was bearing witness to, this horrifying events. And I think that's really an important part of what we do. But the second story is set the scene a little bit. The negotiations, U.S. negotiations with the Taliban and the Afghan government started in 2018, something like that. Zalmay Khalilzad, I'm sure some of you know him. He flies into Kabul. He's meeting with Afghan officials for the first time. The night before, I'd had a source outside Afghanistan, and who's told me that Zal had met with the Taliban already. He had just started his assignment. And Zal sat down at a meeting with President Ashraf Ghani and all of his aides, And they said, have you met with the Taliban? And he said, no. And Ghani pulled out my story and said, you're lying. He said, no, he's lying. But they never trusted him after that. I mean, they didn't trust him a lot in the first place. But this was the start of a negotiation that was going to end a 20-year war. And that sunk it from its...
For those of you who don't know, Zell is the diplomat who negotiated the agreement with the Taliban under the previous administration, under the Trump administration.
So that changed, that affected events a little bit.
Robin?
So the simple answer is yes. Yeah, but I think, so my dad always told me, and this is the most important thing I can say to the students, that to understand any conflict, any issue, any problem, you have to stand on top of the world and look down. And that's what we as foreign correspondents try to do in a way that we don't take sides, that we report what we see, what we hear in a way. And I think what's happened in our professional lifetimes, at least in mine, and I'm older than they are, is that, for example, the first 4 Middle East wars from 1948 to 1973, the media had access to only one side of the Middle East wars, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and it was on the Israeli side. And beginning in 1982, because there were so many correspondents in Beirut, we started seeing the other side of the war. And I think that had a profound impact in the kind of perspective, the thinking in Washington, that you could think kind of bigger picture, you had access to the other side and what they were saying. And I think you can't say in every case that there was cause and effect, but I think that in the same way we inform the public, that we inform policy and the diplomats in many ways that ended up having an enduring impact, just in standing on top of the world and looking down, and not just one side. And I'm thinking about the Arab-Israeli conflict because it was the most obvious one, but that's been true, I think, of I've covered every war, revolution, and uprising around the world since 1973. And I've done 151 countries.
That's right. Yeah.
But I'm older than you.
Robin leads the country sweepstakes here by a lot.
So I think we do, but in different ways, different conflicts. But as I say to students, stand on top of the world and look down at any issue, including your personal life.
Editorial comment there. So that, this audience, a few months ago we brought in a speaker, some of you remember Kristen Wood, and Kristen Wood had actually worked for the CIA for 20 years. She was head of their open source data project, and she came and she talked to you about open source data, what we know, not through classified information. We don't have to have access to classified information. It's what we know the more and more that we know through unclassified information, commercial satellites, all different kinds of services online. So how is that changing? How is social media, how is the availability of open source data changing the work of the foreign correspondent, do you think? And I just open up to any of you.
Go for it.
I would say generationally, the answer is quite clear, that open source data that you can get secondhand has changed the way in which people who are half my age start to feel like they can stand on top of the world, or think about what they think that they know everything about the world without actually talking to a human being. So I would say that there is so much benefit, right? I mean, in terms of just physical safety, there are Russians who can be outside of their own homeland because they will be imprisoned or killed by their government, who can still, with their life experience of knowing their own geography, of knowing the politics, look at open source data from satellites and help describe battlefields where they don't have to physically be there. I think there's a lot of I think younger Western journalists who take that data and run with it, and can also be extraordinarily insightful about trends, about different different clues that help tell a bigger picture. So I don't think it's all bad, but I think that with a lot of reliance now on secondhand data, which may be accurate, we have a false understanding about what we know. And it's not that what we can't see in that new open source electronic data isn't true. It's just it's not the whole picture, because there isn't the whole picture. History cannot be written without human beings. And so I get back to, everyone has to understand basics. If you don't know how to talk to someone, if you don't have the emotional intelligence to talk to people, to get them to open up and confirm what you think you know, then I think you still have growing and learning to do as a journalist.
Good.
So very briefly, to me, social media can be incredibly dangerous. And the fact is, what's the truth? And even as the number of foreign correspondents is diminishing, how many publications have fact checkers? I mean, in my publication, The New Yorker, there's a famous story of how somebody wrote once about a barbershop pole that went clockwise, and the fact checker called back and said, no, it went counterclockwise. Every word we write is supposedly put through the ringer, and it is. But there are very few publications that have fact checkers. The Washington Post has instituted something called Glenn Kessler, who was my colleague for many years, he has this Pinocchio system where he goes through and fact checks what anybody says, and he gives a number of Pinocchios, and 4 is the worst number. But how many publications have that? I don't know, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal do, but I think very few publications do. And nobody's got the bandwidth, because our news cycles have gone from you write 1 piece a day to now you do 3 pieces, the morning news, the afternoon news cycle, the overnight, and you've got to write 3 different pieces. And you've got to get 3 different sources and and it's like nobody can keep up with that pace with fewer resources and fewer correspondents across the board. And so as a result, there's more and more reliance on social media, which half the time, if not more, is hooey.
And what's being generated on social media, you don't even know the source of your source. And that's the key here, right?
And actually, the audience here, the consumer doesn't actually know which outlets are the good fact check, are the very solid fact checkers, and which are not. We don't. We may learn that over time if we really delve into it.
If you'll indulge one more war story. So the summer of 2014, when Russia had invaded Crimea, and there was the first push of Russia into Ukraine, there was also the terrible the terrible shooting down of MH17, the KLM jetliner, and it landed in eastern Ukraine. So there was a group of us, I was still at the Wall Street Journal, there were 3 of us reporters on the ground combing through wreckage of an airplane in the middle of sunflower fields in eastern Ukraine. And we were physically picking up evidence. We were physically looking at the scene. We were physically trying to recreate what had happened in the moments afterwards. And then we had a team of people who were in New York. And they were data journalists and electronic nerds. And they were able to take surveillance satellite footage, and we pieced everything together in a way that was quite extraordinary. We actually built out the map of what had happened for us to be able, like us on the ground, we became like CSI, investigators. We would report geographically, the GPS positions of certain pieces of the plane. Our data team back in New York would then map them and lay that over lots of different satellite imagery. And so we could tell precisely how the rocket hit the plane, where it hit the plane, and then be able to tell really, really credibly that what Russia was saying was actually untrue, and that Russian-backed militias were the ones who shot down the plane. So I think some of the best reporting can use all of those elements together. Over-reliance on one is where we all fall down,
absolutely.
Right? As governments and as journalists.
Absolutely. Robin, let me put this to you, but others can comment. You wrote a book on the Arab Spring and the events, and I don't know what your view was at the beginning of it, and all of you, how lasting it would be, how much change it would bring about. I, to be honest, was pretty skeptical about how much change it would bring about. Of course, I was partially I was in Syria before it, and then and other places afterwards. What lessons have you drawn over the years about how much public opinion expressed, demonstrations, if they're allowed, of course, and not suppressed, how much have they really changed their governments over the long term, or changed how different policies and how policies are made, and nature of regimes even?
Are you talking just about?
No, I'm not. No, I mean, I'm not talking only about the Middle East. No, but I just thought, because you had written about it, but I'm not talking just about the Arab Spring, but in general, how much public opinion, public demonstrations of opinion over time have changed the policies of their own governments.
So there's a rule of thumb in political science, a couple of them. One is that it takes 3 waves to actually secure democratic change. And the first wave is, if you use biology? No. What's plant stuff?
Biology. Botany.
So the first one is you plant the seeds, and they don't.
Technical term.
What?
No, keep going.
So they struggle to sprout, and the ancien regime kind of comes back in because the institutions haven't been changed. And the second generation that tries, then you begin to see the plant sprout, and then the dregs of the ancien regime pushes, runs over it. And it's only with the third wave. And there are, whether it's Sam Huntington or Alva Toffler or whatever, there are lots of various controversial but very serious scholars who write about the 3 waves of change. And so when you look at the kind of conflicts or political crises we have covered in our lifetimes, it is true that the Arab Spring was in many ways that first generation, and it will evolve over time, but it's going to take generations. And we saw this with Hungary, what happened in 1956, and then what happened with the end of the Cold War in 1989, that it just takes time. And so there's no kind of there's no pattern that you can, or time frame you can apply to kind of across the board. And the other political science rule, is that autocracies require at least 30% of the population to sustain themselves, because they have to have 30% to man the military forces and security forces. They need 30% same 30%, to man the bureaucracy and run the state, and they need that same 30% to pay either bribes or taxes. But that's all they need is 30%. And so when you look at how long autocracies survive, if you apply that rule of thumb, and this you get back to Meg's field, economics, and you can kind of tell economically, who that 30% is, if a government had 30% support. So when it comes to a place like Iran right now, and this is a place I've covered since 1973, and I was there for the revolution, and and it's now below 30%. But the problem is there's no civil society, there's no dissident group, there's no viable alternative, because the state still has the tools, the security tools, to repress opposition. So when you understand those 2 rules, you can look at any crisis in the world and kind of understand how it's going to evolve. And so I knew the Arab Spring was inspiring, that it was following the pattern of upheavals that have followed the World War II, but this was that first generation, that first iteration. It planted the seeds, but we haven't gotten beyond that.
Right. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And what you do, I think, with that initial burst of, in this case, the Arab Spring, is you really got the attention of these regimes. And by the way, it doesn't have to be only in their neighborhood. I can tell you that when I lived in Syria under the father, President Hafez al-Assad, he would look around the region, and he didn't get worried about the region. He hated, what he really scared him were the pictures of Ceausescu in Romania being overthrown. And that, I think that really tended to scare him a lot. And as you say, it plants the seeds, but it doesn't necessarily, there's no linear process from there. But other comments?
Can I just add quickly, but that doesn't mean it failed.
Right.
And that's what we have to remember. And the number of people who say to me the Arab Spring failed, and I say, no.
Yep.
It planted the seeds. And we just have to, we as Americans don't have patience. We in the West don't have patience to see the evolution of the process.
I think that there's also a psychological barrier that gets broken, and that has to do innately between your personal and your family's relationship to power and the risks that you're willing to take in order to challenge that power. I was not alive in the 1960s. I don't really know what that looks like, but I do know
just don't rub it in. Just go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that for a lot of Americans, that relationship changed, right? The way in which that Americans treated the institutions that some of us still hold dear, whether it is your church, whether it is the Pentagon, whether it's something else altogether. And those things come slowly for a lot of different cultures, but for all of the time that I've spent in different Islamic cultures and the wider Islamic world, there are different countries where that experience is ingrained and will not change. And for all of the bloodshed that Iraqis have experienced, all of the political chaos that Iraqis have experienced, the upside of all of that was that the personal relationship to the people in power changed. Understanding that you can actually say no to a regime, then choose your next regime, and you have to suffer the consequences sometimes of your vote. But understanding that they need to be beholden to you or accountable to you is the element that makes me much more hopeful about certain countries rather than the utter brutal regimes of terror that we see in a lot of different places where we've lived and worked.
Greg, did you want to add anything or no? I'm going to go to questions in a moment, and I know our audiences have been great in asking questions, but one last, anyone who wants to chime in on this, what's your advice to all of us out there, the consumers, about how best to learn about what's going on overseas, how to filter the different reports that they get, how to make the judgment about what is likely more credible as a report and what might not be. You can talk about the publications that you've been involved in or just strategies. And I look at the students in particular and the rest of the consumers, but particularly students who have to develop what I would call these filtering capabilities. They're going to get bombarded with lots of stories that may be information in the sense of truthful, and they may not be. Anyone?
In the course of my career as a foreign correspondent, I think two things I came to appreciate far more than when I started. One was the importance of ethnicity, clan, tribe. I mean, these were things that drove events, obviously in Rwanda between the Hutus and the Tutsis, but it also drove events in a way in a deeply important way in Afghanistan and Iraq. And if you didn't understand those as a reporter, you weren't going to get this. You weren't going to understand the full story. And I think with every passing year as a foreign correspondent, I understand how important that dynamic was. The second one is religion. I mean, I think that you obviously you understood that far, a long time before a lot of other writers and correspondents. But, I went to divinity school. I was going to be a cleric. I decided to do something else. And so I before 9/11, I understood the importance and the significance of religion in people's lives, right? But after 9/11, it became even more important to understand what was, and I think people tried to understand what Islam was all about. That, and now I think we take some of that for granted. But I think back in response to some of the questions that Larry had about, that has changed. You cannot underestimate. You cannot underestimate the importance of religious dynamics and how they affect events in the foreign countries, in the countries in the war zones where we worked. And I appreciated that with every passing year. You got that really early and understood that very well.
And don't underestimate the power of personalities, individual personalities, as opposed to just regimes. Robin, sorry.
Absolutely right. And the only reason I knew that is because I'm older than you are. But I think we as Americans have the same issue. It is, what is our identity? And we all think we're Americans, but we may define what it is to be an American differently. And that's true everywhere in the world. And it is, whatever it is, your local, your provincial, your state, your religion, your
clan,
your race, this is where, when you look at the 21st century, identity is still a core issue in what we decide to do with our lives, with our political beliefs, with our religious beliefs, in every way. And I think we, again, have to kind of think, when we think what influences us to make decisions in our lives, it is true with every other person on this earth. And we think that, 21st century, more education and access to social media and so forth, it hasn't changed all that much. I wish that it had.
Unfortunately, in terms of the short answer to your question of which sources can you trust, there isn't a short answer, y'all. Sorry. I think that if you are interested in one part of the world or one country of the world, if you're interested in features and color about that part of the world, if you're interested in political economies or analysis, I would say that there are sources for each of those, and there's not necessarily one that does everything incredibly well, or gives you the entire package. It is hard to be a civically engaged, educated human being, and part of why it's hard is that you have to spend time doing it. You don't stop learning once you're out of school. Hopefully, you are learning how to think critically, and so you can use those tools to keep learning as you leave and find things that drive you passionately or spark your curiosity. So I'm not going to sit up here and be a shill for one media organization. However, I will say, from the point of view of looking down from the top of the world and looking down with an analytical viewpoint, I would say, while you're still a student, get The Economist and use that student discount, because you will learn a lot about a lot of different parts of the world and what makes it tick. And I'll stop there, because none of us have ever worked there before, and we can't get...
I would just add one thing, and Meg's absolutely right. But as much as divided as the American press is, even the European press is kind of aligned with one party or another. And the American press, even though we have a firewall between the editorial opinions that come out, or the op-ed page, and the news coverage, and you don't find that in even the British press. And so, whatever you think of, the kind of coverage we provide, we're better off as consumers than an awful lot of others. And I will say, on Meg's description of what the New York Times has done and bringing together the video, it's unmatched by any other publication in doing the kind of investment and merging the different video and audio and data, and as well as the reporting on the ground. It's unmatched. And I just want to add one last thing, what Larry said about all the investment in covering, foreign news. Let me just say, none are so well paid.
So the only thing I can say for certain is that if you read anything with any of their bylines, it's truthful and accurate. Okay, so I'll take questions. Raise your hand, and I'll bring over the microphone.
You talk a lot about your sources. Obviously, that's not a question, your sources, but how you get your sources. And Is it over a drink, or at a football game, or how do you work that? And do you have any interesting stories about that?
We all do. Yeah. How long do we have him? Why isn't there an open bar here?
And what's the condition? What's the condition of your livers as a foreign correspondent?
Just one. I mean, I couldn't get anyone in Kabul or in Washington to talk to me seriously about what was going on with the Taliban in negotiations with the U.S., with Zal. So I flew to Oman and met the Qatari diplomat there, and that was safe for him, and that was good for me because the Afghans didn't know where I went because I went through Dubai.
So,
Robin?
Can I answer that?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, one of my favorite stories is I was in Mozambique for independence in 1975, and I went to get a telephone line. And in those days, it was the clunky old phone that the PTT actually handed you. And they said, no, sorry, no phones. Waiting list is 9 years long. And and I said, I'm here covering your independence, the end of your civil war, and so forth. No. So I worked, through the different layers, and I finally got to the last, the top guy. And he said, no, 9 years. And I realized that he spoke English, not with a South African accent, Mozambique border South Africa, but he spoke with an American accent. So I turned to him, and I, in desperation, having flirted, batted my eyes, begged, whatever, I said, have you been to the United States? And he proudly said, yes, he'd gone to university in the United States. And I said, where? And he said, the University of Michigan. And I said, born, bred, brought up, educated 3 degrees in Ann Arbor.
Go Blue.
And he said, go Blue is right. And he said, if you can sing Hail to the Victors, I'll give you a phone. So I stood on a chair, and I said, Hail to the Victors, valiant hail. I not only got a phone, when I turned my phone in, I said, I haven't gotten a phone bill. He tried it off, came back and said, no phone bill.
That was a good one.
Yeah, so those of us from the SEC have never experienced that before, but I will say that, again, I've done a lot of breaking news in my time, but the best sources come from a place of mutual respect. So it is about taking time. It is about sharing, breaking bread. It is about sharing a beer, depending on what country you live in. It is sometimes about bringing beer to the country where someone can't get it. But it is primarily being human, right? And being transactional works in some settings, but very rarely in my experience. If you're really looking for good in-depth reporting, it takes something greater than that. It's like any relationship, you need to build it over time. The book that I wrote came after, over a decade of knowing individuals who, and then actually being able to express my sympathy when people close to them die. It's remembering people's birthdays. It is doing all the things that you need to do in order to earn friendship and earn trust. So whatever that takes. And I don't say that in a way that is manipulative. Like, if you understand that, you can succeed in this profession.
I would say, finding sources in a capital is one thing, but nothing replaces, in a war zone, going out there and going to the spot where there was, a massacre or a battle that there's disputed who's responsible. There's nothing replaces, no source in a capital replaces going there and looking yourself and counting yourself and talking to locals yourself. Capitals can be kind of a fishbowl, and getting out and going up country, so to speak, is you have to do it. You have to do it.
Question over here.
Yes. Sometime in the early to middle 1990s, my daughter was attending Oxford, and we went over there to visit her. My wife and I went over to visit her, and she threw a party, and we had a bunch of friends that she had made, many of whom were with the British Foreign Service. And I happened to have asked them during the course of the party whether they would take the opportunity, especially since one of the women was being stationed over in Iraq and the Middle East, to read books that were it would be helpful. He said, well, like what kind of books? And I said, well, like reading Desert Queen, Gertrude Bell, and things like that. The question, and she said, no, we wouldn't take the time to do that. The question is, as foreign correspondents, when you know you're going somewhere, would you read some important books that you know would provide you with a lot of background information that might be important in understanding where you were going and what you were walking into?
Yes. And sometimes we write those books that other people should read.
But I mean, sometimes though, I mean, Meg and I were in Moscow on 9/11. We'd come back. We'd been in Istanbul. We flew back to Moscow, and on the TV we saw the Twin Towers come down. Within days, I was off to Afghanistan through Tajikistan. Meg was off to Pakistan. And we knew nothing. We had Ahmed Rashid's book on the Taliban. Most of correspondents, there were a few people who had covered the insurgency for a long time, were really incredible people. But a lot of us just had this one book that we barely had time to read. There was a war on. You had to learn on the fly. You had to spend a lot of, you were just grabbing any kind of articles, book, anything you could, but often there just wasn't time. It just wasn't always possible.
Question over here.
Meg, you mentioned that you got your first break in journalism because you spoke Russian. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm a retired foreign language teacher, so I'm going to come at the standpoint of it's very important to speak another language. How do you learn to cope with as many countries as all three of you have reported and worked in? How do you cope with the language skills that you may not have when you're trying to talk with people on the street?
Well, I think that the God's honest truth is that generally there's a whole support staff that's there to help you out, and they are the unsung heroes of everything. Most of the stories that we have just spent an hour describing. So this is why it gets very expensive to put foreign correspondents in the field. It's that you do need someone who lives there full time, who knows the bureaucracies, that can get your business license, that can pay your phone bill.
The fixers and all those things.
And so, I spent 4 hard years at 8 o'clock class every morning as an undergrad. I actually learned Russian and used it. I've used it for 20 years. It was the skill that kept on giving, in large part because the places where I've been were either part of the former Soviet sphere of influence, or it was a place like Israel where there were 1 million Russian speakers who had moved there, and so it is unfortunately the skill that I keep using. However, I would say that in order to really understand, it's very helpful again to gain trust with people in the street when you can at least try to say five words, 3 phrases. It helps break the ice. It helps them to understand you, I think, and generally gives them something to laugh about, which is a great way to break the ice.
Robin?
Can I say something before the other half of the students leave? And that is, the most important thing I can tell you is to learn 2 languages in your life, only one of which is a European language, French or Spanish,
Right.
and the other one should be, whether it's Russian, Chinese, Urdu, Arabic, whatever, is a second language, because in your lifetime, globalization is the most important phenomena, and the connection, your ability to connect, will be important no matter what profession you go into. And so, it's the bottom line. For the first half of my career, we didn't have fixers. I mean, I carried around a typewriter, and we punched telex machines to get our... And so the idea of having someone who spoke another language or was a fixer or could make appointments, was just unheard of. And it's only really in the last maybe 25 years, maybe 30 years. I'm dating myself, but this is a kind of current phenomena, and it's and fixers and stringers and so forth can be well-intentioned, but they may have their own sense of their country, their community, and
their own biases. I mean, yeah.
And so, this is where it's a filter, and they have the ability to filter what you know. And so that's, kind of a built-in danger. It's a great luxury, but it's a danger too.
It's an incredible complex relationship.
Yeah.
I mean, with
and just to
citizens.
echo, I mean, diplomats in some of the same ways are reporters, and you're dealing with people. You're doing one-on-one interviews. You may call them meetings, but they're often interviews. You're not publishing based on that. But I will tell you that my Arabic capability was in Arabic would be nus, which is 50-50. But I would go to meetings, and I had an interpreter if I wanted it from the embassy, right? I could have taken the interpreter with me, but that would have changed the atmosphere of the meeting. Because the person I'm meeting with would be saying, well, I know this guy's a diplomat. Who the heck does he work for? Or she work for? And so I didn't do that. And did I understand less of that discussion as a result? Yes. Maybe I understood only 50% of the discussion. But it was probably, and I think I could prove this, a much more frank discussion back and forth, even if I couldn't understand 100% of it. But creating that atmosphere with some of the language at least helped a lot. We have a question in front.
So you all mentioned, you especially Ms. Wright, mentioned the disconnect between us in the West and how we're very impatient and how that's kind of different over in Arab countries and elsewhere. And so I was wondering how, with like getting in a new assignment and finding that you're going to a new country that you've never been before, how do you like choose to almost like integrate into society? You just kind of like accept like whether knowing that you're going to be living there for a long period or not? Do you kind of like, do you take it as just like I'll be here for a week, or do you just assume that you'll be there for months?
So I always live as the locals live, and I have always made a point, because what my father said to me, of going to the other side. So my father was one of the commanders who liberated the first U.S. liberated concentration camp during World War II. And so I always understood the importance of Israel's existence and so forth. So I went to live in Beirut to understand the other side of it. And I've only embedded with the U.S. military once. And it was at the very end of our Afghan experience when I went with the head of Central Command to Afghanistan, in Iraq, Syria. We did a bunch of kind of things. It's the only time, and it's the only time I've ever worn a flak jacket or a helmet. Because I always want to live with the same, whether it's food shortages or physical dangers, because otherwise I can't report honestly about, what it's like to live in that area. My mother always said I was crazy, but, what I experienced was quite genuine. As a result, my mother came to visit me in most war zones.
Any other questions? Yeah. Hold on, let me just bring the mic to you. And then maybe we'll take just one more after that.
I'm just very curious about, in this country and a lot of places, bloggers, vloggers, there's just the access to all the digital tools. Anybody can all of a sudden step up and be reporter or whatever. Opinion. What's the role of those types of folks? Is there a role in some of the places you've been these days? Are they sources of information for you all? Do they exist in the way that they exist in our society? I'm just curious.
Yes, absolutely. And for places where it's very hard to publish freely, the online world is a place where people can express an opinion, and so again, I think there's I don't want to denigrate the absolute benefits of social media platforms. As journalists, it's an interesting way when you're not actually physically in the country to hear different opinions. But you need to also understand that people who do have access to those platforms are not generally the average person on the street. Having said that, there are, for example, I spent a lot of time in the Arab world, so this is where this is coming from. But, there are a lot of young Arab women professionals who don't have, who just don't have the social space to say what they want to say in public. And they take on personalities online, which allows them to do that. And it is a kind of freedom that is liberating and emotionally cathartic for them. I think that, again, when you're starting to interact with them in that space online, for me, you take time to get to know who they are and then find out who they really are. And then before I would ever use them as a source myself, I would actually go and meet them and make sure that they're actually who they say who they've told me they were, right? So there are thousands of stories like that, and I think just from my experience as a woman, I know hundreds of women like that who use social media for that reason. I think that they're just like here, there's places for entertainment, there's places for personal expression, for creativity, for breaking boundaries where your society is a little bit more straight-laced. There's really there's no way to translate in Arabic being your authentic self. Just doesn't exist as a linguistic term. And so the digital space becomes that space.
Okay, one last question here.
My question is going to be a little different. I'd like an opinion from Ms. Wright on Iran. Is that appropriate? Is that okay? Okay, with what's transpiring right now with Iran, with Nasrallah's death, with Sinwar's death reported today, with Israel poised to attack Tehran at any moment, and what you stated, which I appreciated hearing about the 30%, which is declining, and the wave, are we closer to seeing, in your opinion, the end of this theocratic regime?
Thank you.
Easy question.
Excuse me, sorry.
And this goes back to what are the alternatives? And there isn't a vibrant civil society. There isn't a political alternative. There are some exiles who've mobilized, and they've drawn some attention among exiles, particularly in the West. But they, the kids in Tehran will tell you they don't represent them either. So I'll take you one step further than that. When we've seen, so I witnessed the birth of political Islam, and I was saying to them this over dinner, so I'm sorry to repeat myself, but the issue kind of is, where are we headed with all this? And is it kind of changing the political trend in the Middle East where the Islamist extremist groups have provided the only alternative because the dictators of power have not necessarily allowed an alternative to evolve, and so the only vehicle was the way out, which was religion. So when it comes to what Israel does next, the United States has made clear that it doesn't want Israel to attack Iran's oil facilities or its still nascent nuclear. I mean, it has an enrichment capability that's very dangerous, but it takes 3 different components to build a nuclear weapon. And they're close on one, the other 2 will still take them months. The CIA estimates up to a year. So what does that leave? So that leaves military and security targets. And to do that, because Israel is far enough away, it would need to refuel. And it's refueling, and our military expert here knows, it would take, and Israel has old 707s to refuel. It doesn't have the newer models that we've promised to give them, which will take another couple of years to get to them. And as a result, its ability to target military and security facilities have limits. And to do that, as our military expert here knows, you have to take out what are known as command and control facilities first. And to do that, it's a much more complicated, kind of multi-phase operation. Tell me if I'm wrong here.
You have to fly over 6 Arab nations' airspaces.
Yeah, and they've all said to us, therefore to Israel, not flying over us. And this includes Saudi Arabia, the UAE.
But Robin, sorry, but isn't there a difference between not giving permission and just looking the other way?
Well, some of these countries have Yeah, it's not, you have to fly over a chunk of territory to do that. It's not so easy. So this is where it gets complicated. And the question, and this is a long way of getting to answer, is what happens next? And we still don't know what happens next in Gaza. We don't know what's going to happen next in Lebanon, and what Israel is trying to achieve. And what does it want for Iran? Is it looking for regime change? Is it looking just to weaken it militarily? It's clearly had an enormous impact in weakening the capabilities of Hezbollah and Hamas. But it hasn't eliminated them because, again, there's no political alternative to track the support of the locals. And so that means that the idea still exists, and it's very hard for Israel to eliminate that idea. And so I get back to what I said about, is this a moment, political extremism, kind of the air goes out of the balloon? I'm not sure yet we're anywhere close to that. And this is why we didn't have a good plan after Iraq. We didn't have a good plan for after Afghanistan. We got the Taliban back. So this is where, thinking through the whole thing is really important. And we need to do that politically. It's as important politically as it is militarily.
So let me just give you the last question here, since you've been cited a few times.
Yeah, I'm, I guess, the semi-military expert. Robin, and to all of you, but what you didn't, or you were alluding to, is the next part of the gentleman's question is...
Is it General too?
Yeah, gentleman.
Oh, gentleman.
What is the end state that Netanyahu wants? There's a difference between, that's exactly right. No one seems to know, but I'm not even sure the Israeli military knows, because the operations they're conducting aren't necessarily anchored to anything of a strategic end state, which is the same mistake we made in Iraq. It's the same one we made in Vietnam. And candidly, the Israelis are repeating this all over again. It was like Lebanon in 82 and Lebanon in 86. How do you see that playing out, particularly when you know that Netanyahu's got a similar problem to someone here, where if conflict ends, he's got to face the judicial end of his career?
You've answered your own question, but I'm going to let these two, because...
That makes it much easier, right?
And you answered it really well. But these two are both based in Jerusalem, so I'll let them talk about that.
I can't tell you the name of a prime minister of Israel in the last 15 years that has not faced a judicial inquiry after the end of their tenure. So that is not a red line. That's not keeping anybody up at night, I don't think. I think that ultimately the Netanyahu and his government wants a unified Israel that goes from the border of Jordan to the Mediterranean. And the smoke and the damage and the dead bodies everywhere else, if that keeps the pressure off of them to create that reality, I think that ultimately that is what they're after. Weakening your enemies on the exterior borders in order to increase the realities around the border of a greater Israel is, I think, the ultimate end zone. And the human cost doesn't matter.
Yeah, I would say the most dismaying thing in the reaction to October 7th, 2023 was all the lawmakers pushing to, exterminate, crush Hamas, blah, blah, blah. I mean, with no taking the next step and the responsibility to say, okay, what's the end game? That anybody, if you're going to go that, okay, fine. How possible is that? And if it's not possible, is it possible? If it's not possible, what is it we're after? And we're almost 13 months later, and the same people are still pushing for, an attack on Iran and say, okay, what's the end game here? And they don't have the decency, I think, the moral decency, and take the responsibility to say, okay, where does it end? Because it doesn't end, it only ends with a political solution. Whatever that political solution is, it's not going to end this way.
Robin, you wanted to say something else?
Just one last thing, and these two will know it very well as well. The Bush administration in 2006 pushed Israel to allow the Palestinians to hold an election. I covered that election. I was on the ground
In Gaza.
in the West Bank.
Yeah, well, I know it's but mostly.
And Jimmy Carter was one of your native sons, was a monitor on that election, and it was judged by there were the international IRI, the International Republican
Institute,
and NDI, the National Democratic Institute, both had monitors there. There were Europeans. I mean, it was one of the most kind of transparent elections held in the Middle East ever, and I knew, this is Condoleezza Rice, I used to travel with her, and she was pressing the Israeli, gotta have this election, and the Palestinians weren't crazy about it either, because because the PLO knew it was in trouble. And before the election, it was clear to anybody who was on the ground that the PLO was going to lose and Hamas was going to win.
This was 2006, right?
This was 2006.
Well, I was in Gaza and covering the Hamas side, and everybody they were exultant because the PLO had been so corrupt. The PA had been so corrupt, and the fact is that Hamas had been pushed by as a counterweight to the nationalists on the PA side.
And
the Israeli Sharon. Yeah. So anyway.
And now today I listened to the kind of reaction to the death of Sinwar, and talk about, now we can have a democratic transition. It's like, been there, done that, and beware what you risk. And this is where, again, who's got 30% of the support in Gaza and the West Bank? And the reality is that you've got armed gangs, and that there are some people who probably, whether it's anger at Israel or the United States because we provide the weapons for destruction, that are we going to see a pro-Western, pro-Israel, pro-U.S. Alternative? So I was telling him earlier today that David Petraeus was on Jake Tapper this afternoon, and so Jake was asking him, what's the alternative for governance in Gaza? And he said, we need to create a lot of gated communities. And he invoked Iraq as the example, and I looked at him, I know Petraeus, and so does Larry, and I'm sure these two do too, and I thought, Iraq worked out so well for us. So, with all due respect to Dave.
Go ahead, Meg, you want to say
so
something?
deep thinkers have no great solutions here, because ultimately, if there is a significant number of people who have ethnic, linguistic, religious ties, who believe that they have the God-given right to independence, they're going to keep resisting. And you may not like that as the neighbor next door, but if you ignore that, you will have an ever-ending war.
I will just add that the Arab governments also have decisions to make. We're talking about, does Israel have a plan? Does it have a strategy? The Arab states have a lot of decisions to make about their relationships with these groups, Hamas and Hezbollah. Also, for example, a question that's always, that the Gulf has always had to deal with, how much do we support Lebanon or not support Lebanon? And how that will have an effect on the future of Lebanon. So it's all the countries of the region have decisions to make.
About the Gulf countries as the super PACs that destabilize Lebanon and Israel-Palestine.
Here we go.
Dark money.
Okay.
And when you say Arab governments, remember you're talking mostly about Arab dictators.
I'm talking about Arab regimes in many cases, as opposed to government.
Not what the Arab.
No. I'm not. True. I'm not talking about popular referenda on what these strategies will be. Anyway, Robin, thank you so much for coming down. Hold on just one second. Thank you so much for coming from Washington in the midst of, I can tell you how busy she is, and you'll be seeing her on television, and you'll be reading her pieces in the New Yorker and elsewhere, particularly. Sorry?
And debating Petraeus.
Debating Petraeus. And Meg and Craig, thank you so much for what you're doing here in your local guys in providing quality journalism. But also, again, thank you for, I think you all heard today the dedication to their craft of getting you the important stories. Thank you all very, very much for coming, and don't forget November 18th at the Coastal Georgia Center on the very important topic of U.S. nuclear strategy and the threats from Russia and China. Thank you.